Hey everyone, and welcome to my newest Octatrack video. So, today I want to talk about my most recent uh, self-inflicted predicament. And first of all, I want to make a shout out to Travis at Motu for kind of encouraging me to put this video up. I met up with Travis, or I met Travis at NAMM yesterday, and just like happened to start talking about my live performance setup because I use Motu for pretty much all of my live shows for anything that I need regarding preamp or direct kind of mixing stuff. And I was kind of going through my ongoing saga of optimizing my live performance setup, particularly in the case of collaborating with other artists. And so I was a bit hesitant to make this video because there's so many pieces of it. But I think it's going to be worth going through each piece and kind of explaining why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I've put so much time into thinking about the back end organization of things. So shout out to Travis for encouraging that. So yeah, let's talk a bit about background. I have said yes to perform with maybe 4 or 5 artists. We're going to go to South by, and then beyond that, we're just performing in LA. I'm playing my own songs. They're playing their songs. And over the last year of performing shows with different people using the Octatrack, I've noticed that there are certain things that I want from my Octatrack design that just weren't happening. And it took me some time to figure out what I wanted. And I kind of want to just outline a little bit of the main points to what I'm trying to accomplish here. So number one is sort of like having a set that is flexible enough to accommodate different performers. I think I've been looking for a way to make a project that can play everyone's tracks. Not only for the ease of just like having one project and not having to worry about like editing multiple projects, but also just the fact that, you know, a lot of us perform similar styles of music or at least kind of adjacent styles of music. And the hope would be that we could play together and maybe have guest performances and just kind of have things be a little bit modular that way. So that was a big motivating factor. So flexibility is a really big must. And flexibility kind of comes in different forms because I also wanted the performance to be something that starts simple and can be as simple as just playing the tracks and then can also be as complicated as looping and all these other things, kind of depending on what my mood is that night or depending on what direction people want to go. I found that when you try to design a project in the Octatrack, and you don't account for things like flexibility, you end up kind of writing yourself into a very specific kind of show. So I kind of wanted to approach the project in a new way. I wanted a project that I could use over a long term, so I wanted to build in some of the elements that I would want to use in the future, but also to be able to do a simplified version of that. And so I'll kind of explain what that means soon. And then ultimately, one of the most important parts about the design this time around was making sure that I'm responsible for the show, ultimately. If you've seen my previous videos, you're probably familiar with how I use arrangements to sort of design my set. And while that has been really helpful for me during my own solo performances, I think it's also become a bit of a crutch. I think when you use something this powerful on stage, it becomes very easy to sort of like give the Octatrack the responsibility of playing the beats, of switching the patterns, of doing almost all the work for you, and then kind of giving you a bit of like a secondary role to kind of plug in elements as you're performing. And so I kind of wanted to take the responsibility back on as somebody who will be organizing the show, as somebody who will be sort of initiating a jam of some kind, and also feel like I'm actually involved in the show as it's happening. Because as much as I can, you know, program stuff into here, most of the time the audience has no clue what I'm doing. So I found that it's much more rewarding to be in charge, to be at the helm of what's going on, even if it is happening in the Octatrack, but to be the person responsible for that, I think helps my mental conception of the project and of the performance as a whole. So, if you haven't noticed yet, just prepare for a fairly dry, highly descriptive version of my Octatrack series today. But, you know, if you've made it this far, you're probably used to it by now. So let's continue. To start with, I've basically split the qualities of my project into a number of sort of subtopics. And we're going to go over like the main elements of it. So we'll start at the macro level. I've basically organized my project in a very intentional way. So what we have here is my audio pool is separated in tens. So the first 10 I've sort of sectioned off for universal samples that I might want to trigger, regardless of what song it is. Maybe they're sound effects or rises or something that I can kind of play with during the show. And again, I still haven't really figured out what that's going to be, but I know that that's something in the future that I want to do. So skipping ahead, I've basically given each artist 10 slots in the audio pool. And so starting with me, I have 11 through 20. My friend Annabelle has 21 through 30. My friend Def has 31 through 40. And essentially, each of these artists is alphabetized down the list. The reason I did this is because I've also separated every artist by bank. So I am part of bank 1, Annabelle is bank 2, Def is bank 3, and so on. And what this lets me do is I can look at my audio pool and I know exactly where each track is. So if I want to play, for example, Burn, I can go straight to pattern 4 of bank 1. And now I'm playing that track. So I've basically allowed my audio pool to double as a reference point for my patterns. If I didn't do this, I think it would be very difficult for me to know where everything is without an arrangement. My arranger in the past has labels for every track because I would have multiple patterns per track, like maybe 3 patterns would represent a single track. So the only way to keep that clear was to have an arrangement that labeled all of those things very clearly. In this case, I can do without the arranger, and I just have to look to my audio pool to see exactly where to trigger these songs. So here my mind is going to be bank 2, pattern 4. Or sorry, bank 2, pattern 4. There are obviously some limitations to having one pattern per track. Obviously, I can't really pre-program very much in the way of introductions or transitions. I have one pattern to launch my track, and that's it. I've chosen to see this more as an advantage and sort of a call to be more responsible about what I'm doing while the performance is happening. I think in the past with the arrangement mode, I could kind of be a bit lazy on stage and just hit play. And I used to even set the length of how long that track would be looping or that pattern would last before it goes to the next track. So essentially I could just press play and let the set play itself out. But basically having one pattern forces me to make the core of the performance within that one pattern. So essentially I'm saving the section that I want to play right on pattern 1. If I want an introduction, I have to play it myself and do some kind of looping convention before I launch into the song. An additional element that you might be wondering about is tempo. I've switched between multiple tracks here, and there hasn't been any tempo adjustment of any kind. Basically what I did was I took this track that I'm playing everything through, and I've set it to not be time stretched. The reason I did this is because I think the most important thing about the performance is making sure nothing trips up the flow of the show. So sacrificing the synchronization of the file, I think, is a big step towards making sure that the show is about the music and not about making sure that it can stay in time with the sequencer. I think what I realized was syncing this to tempo means having the Octatrack locked to tempo at all times, and the only way you can do that is by using the arranger to pre-design tempos. The other way you can do it is by going in and switching the tempo manually every time you change tracks, which I still recommend doing, but in this case, if I forget, then I don't end up accidentally playing a super slow version of the song. I can just play the track, and then I can adjust after the fact. And what are we on right now? We are on, what track is it? We are on number 24. And by the way, you can figure out what track you're on just by holding down the P-locked track here. Because basically, to get past the 4-part limit, I'm using P-locks to choose what track is playing depending on the pattern. So track 4 is bound to number 24, track 3 is bound to number 23, and so on. So if I'm figuring out where I am in the set, I can just hold down this trigger and I can see I'm at number 23 here. So you'll notice that the track is not actually synced to tempo here. In this case, we're talking about, I think what happened was I played it back, but it wasn't in tempo, and then I synced it up manually. So the tempo internal to the Octatrack is at 97. The track is at 97, but it's out of sync. What do we do with that information? Well, honestly, it doesn't really matter all that much because since I'm only using one track, all of these other things are samplers or loopers, and I've assigned them to not be bound to tempo. Actually, this one still needs to be technically like that. I mean, this is a bit more up in the air, and I think I'll be tweaking this over time, but at the moment, the loopers are not bound to tempo, and the flex machines are. What that lets me do is I can loop things with the OP1, and it doesn't matter where I hit record because it's still going to be stopping at the point that is 4 bars. So even if this isn't exactly on, it doesn't matter. Ideally, though, you would set the tempo to the appropriate speed before you start the track. But that's something that I want to practice doing over time so that I familiarize myself with. And in the meantime, I don't want to trip myself up or trip the show up by messing it up. Another thing that I want to address is the fact that my stems have been reduced to a single track. I did this because of a number of reasons. One being that whenever I asked people for stems, I got a variety of different things. Sometimes it's, produced stems, sometimes they're compressed, sometimes they're not, sometimes, everything's mixed up. And I decided that the easiest way to proceed is to basically just ask for an instrumental, which most people have, and isn't too much to ask. So I get an instrumental and I just work with what we've got. So in this case, we have, actually I prepared these stems myself, so a little bit better than usual. So we're playing this track here. And now that this is synced to tempo, Oh, actually, is it? Hold on. We're at 107. Right. So, as I'm recording this, or as I'm playing this track back, I have 3 flex machines here, and I can actually choose to loop them by recording 4-bar phrases. So I'm recording this kind of breakdown, low percussion section. So we're just going to create a loop there. And say I want to record a second one here. Maybe this one has more of the hi-hat tambourine action. So now I have 2 loops here. And we can just pretend that, you know, we're finishing up the song here. As the track ends, I switch back to this breakdown, and now we can extend the track indefinitely. Maybe I can switch between these 2 patterns even. This one's actually set to half speed. But you get the point. You can kind of switch between these different things as layers. And that basically lets me jam along to the track once I've actually performed the whole thing. It does require you to be a bit proactive when it comes to recording your samples through the performance, but this is just one way that I've found of extending the performance. Other ways include sampling the track as I have in this one, and then maybe sampling some loops that I've been playing during the performance. So then these will exist separate and outside of the instrumental, and then once the track ends, I can kind of jam along to these different pieces. Additionally, if you record something to one of these record buffers, and as long as you have your time stretch set to on or auto, now you have a time stretched version of this track. So we're at 107. Say we've been planning on switching to Hear My Mind, which is at 114, and it's what? Let's see, bank. Well, basically pattern 4 within the same set of within the same bank. So I'm about to switch to pattern 4, which is going to start playing from here. But maybe I start upping the tempo, or I could even play it from the second one. And then we're going to go to pattern 4. And then we can slowly fade this in. And I think at some point I would probably design a scene in which I can crossfade, you know, these tracks into that track. But you get the picture. Basically, what I'm saying is that even though your main instrumental is not bound to tempo, everything else is. So as long as you find a way to sync up after you've started your track, whether that's by nudging it using cue right and left, or by not nudging it at all and just kind of using samples as you see fit. There's a lot of different ways you can still make the project work with the tempo, using loops that are time stretched, for example, as I demonstrated. that's the main core of the design behind this project. I do want to add a couple other little tidbits. I've set my inputs A, B, and C, D. You'll notice there's no through machine. In the past, I've had a lot of fun using through machines to cue tracks, to audition them before I actually play them. But in this case, I've decided to just go to mix and set my direct in to full. What this lets me do is it takes away some of the headache of having different parameter jumps, for example. Say I'm, going from one bank to another. Now, the goal is for them to have identical parts across banks, because basically I'm using the same session and the same effects for different tracks that are just organized by bank for like mental purposes. But there's always some kind of weird idiosyncrasy where I adjusted the distortion or I adjusted the delay, and then we jump to a different bank, and because the default part isn't like set to the same distortion or the same delay, it causes some kind of weird jump or something like that that's disruptive. So to remove all of that and to kind of remove the responsibility of gain staging in the Octatrack, which I still think is like not the most fun part about using it, I basically just decided to use direct in and just make it somebody else's problem. In this case, my vocalist, Annabelle, has a TC Helicon, and we found that she can plug hers in via stereo 1/4 inch, and she can gain stage herself. And this basically means that whatever comes out of here is the master, and then we just send that to speakers and we're good to go. It's pretty exciting because it also allows me to record her A/B direct in. So I can be looping her voice as she's singing or sampling it for later. The OP1 is the same. It goes in through the reverb pedal, and then it goes into CD, which allows me to just direct monitor. And again, that's one of those things that might be seen as a detriment, but it actually, I think, helps keep me honest as to what these patterns and what these instruments sound like. I think in the past when I was performing, I noticed that I was more timid about the choices I was making because I had that kind of buffer of like auditioning it in the background. But, if you spend half the time you're on stage, like auditioning sounds and not using them, then you're wasting time because, there's a performance happening. So I've been trying to stray away from that kind of workflow, especially in a live setting. That's one of the biggest changes, I think, is moving away from arrangements, moving away from through machines, and putting the responsibility of the show back onto my brain. Again, I'll reiterate, like, this equipment is extremely powerful, and it makes you want to do everything in the box. But at the same time, I think that removes some of the sort of the performer-audience relationship, and to bring that back, I think limiting the amount that's going on in the box and putting the responsibility back on yourself to perform, to make slices, to understand the structure of the songs, goes a really long way in making a performance exciting and something that you can collaborate with other people with. Because that's like, honestly, that's the biggest thing. Like if I'm performing with 5 different people, if you're working with other people, you're doing yourself a favor to divert responsibility back to yourself, because the more control you have over over how the performance goes, the easier you can respond to somebody else's kind of unexpected situations or ideas. And when it comes to collaborative performance, that's a huge piece of what makes it exciting to perform with people. I think when it's just you, or it's just me rather, I have more of an opportunity to design things that are intricate within the machine that I understand only. But if I'm working with somebody else, I want to have a bit more flexibility. So anyway, hope that was helpful to you guys. Definitely leave any comments, questions. I tried to be as clear as possible, but there's definitely a good chance that I missed something or didn't fully explain something. So feel free to ask questions or provide any suggestions or, what have you. Thanks again for watching.